Every galaxy needs a center, and for 25,000 years, this one had Coruscant, a single planet buried so deep under its own city that no one alive had ever seen its natural soil. The seat of the Galactic Republic, later the throne of Palpatine's empire. When you pictured power in that galaxy, the Senate, the Jedi Temple, the polished boots of a million bureaucrats, you were picturing this world, the address at the center of everything, the place the whole map bent toward. And here's the thing, almost no one who lived there ever knew. Long before the first senator ever drew breath, long before humans looked down from those towers and imagined themselves the natural rulers of the stars, that same planet wore a collar. Coruscant was a slave world, and the people on it, the ancestors of the species that would one day govern a galaxy from its surface, were not masters of anything. They were property, livestock with a pulse. Sit with the shape of that for a second, because it's genuinely upside down. The story every human in that galaxy told themselves, that they were the default, the center, the ones history happened around, starts in exactly the opposite place. It starts with people who had no names. People who were counted, not known. People whose great cosmic role was to be useful to somebody stronger until they weren't, at which point they were discarded, or worse. This isn't a fan theory, it's baked into the deep lore of the old expanded universe, what fans now call legends. And it's laid out plainly in sources like the Essential Atlas, the closest thing that continuity had to an official map of galactic history. According to that history, tens of thousands of years before the Republic, a power older than almost anything we have names for reached out from the dark edge of the galaxy and took Coruscant. Took it the way you take a field, or a mine, or a herd. And the humans there, the whole species, at its cradle, were folded into an empire that saw them as a resource to be spent. We're going to walk the entire length of that story tonight. How it happened, who did it, what it actually meant to be owned by these particular masters, because the details are worse than slavery alone can carry. There were machines involved, and hunger, and a very deliberate kind of forgetting. We're going to reach a point where even the galaxy's own historical records can't agree on whether it happened at all. And I'll show you why that disagreement is the most revealing part of the whole thing. And we're going to end back here, on this same throne world, and you'll never look at that gleaming skyline the same way again. But to understand how the future kings of the galaxy started out in chains, you first have to meet the ones who put them there. And they were not the villains you'd guess. Forget the Sith. The Sith are practically modern by comparison. The thing that conquered Coruscant was older, stranger, and it ate its own dead. It didn't build an empire on fear of the dark side. It built one out of the dark side. Literally, mechanically, the way you build an engine out of fuel. And the first people it poured into that engine were still learning to walk upright under an open sky they'd soon lose. Everyone thinks they know where evil starts in this galaxy. It wears black, it breathes through a mask, it whispers about the dark side in a Senate cloakroom, the Sith. But the Sith are latecomers, newcomers even. Roll the clock back past every Sith Lord you can name, past the founding of the Jedi Order, past the founding of the Republic itself, and you arrive at a species that was already ancient when all of that began. They called themselves the Builders. History would remember them by the name of their homeworld, the Rakata. They came from a planet called Lihan, tucked away in the unknown regions, that black wilderness beyond the edge of every civilized map. And they were not, by any measure a human would recognize, decent people. The Legends histories are blunt about it in a way Star Wars usually isn't. The Rakata were cruel, savage, and arrogant. Those are the words the sources actually reach for. They stripped whole planets bare of metal and ore and gas until nothing was left. They reshaped worlds to suit whatever they needed that century and moved on. They killed entire slave workforces when the work was done. And this is the detail that tells you what you're dealing with. They ate the bodies of the enemies they killed. Sometimes they ate their own. A Rakatan lord who caught a subordinate spying might simply consume him and think nothing of it. This was a culture where cannibalism wasn't a taboo broken in desperation. It was just Tuesday. So how does a species like that get its hands on the power to conquer a galaxy? Not on its own. And here's where the story does something I love, because it refuses to let anyone be a self-made monster. The Rakata didn't invent their greatness, they were handed it. Long before the Infinite Empire existed, a far gentler species called the Qua, force-sensitive, reptilian, wise in the deep mechanics of the universe, came to Lahan and did what advanced, benevolent species in this galaxy always seem to do. They uplifted the locals. They taught the Rakata about the Force. They gave them technology technology. According to the Dawn of the Jedi comics, the single richest source we have for this whole era, the Kwa treated the Rakata the way they treated many primitive peoples before, as students to be raised up. It went wrong almost immediately. The Kwa preached balance, light and dark held in careful tension, the same principle that would one day sit at the heart of the Jedi. The Rakata listened, nodded, and then reached for the dark side with both hands and never let go. Balance was for the weak. Power was the only lesson they'd actually come to learn. And when the Kawa realized too late that they'd armed a species of cannibals with the secrets of the Force, when they saw what their students were becoming, the students turned on the teachers. The Rakata attacked the very people who'd raised them. In the fighting on Lihan, Kawa died by the score holding the line, buying time to destroy their own greatest technology rather than let it fall into those hands. That's who took Coruscant. Not a proud native empire that clawed its way up. A pack of ungrateful pupils who murdered their tutors and kept the knife. And you might think that's the bottom of it, that the Rakata sat at the top of some pyramid of cruelty with no one above them. You'd be wrong, because the KWA weren't the top of anything either. There was a tier above even them, a power so old the galaxy barely dares to name it, and it had a use for the Rakata too. The masters of Coruscant, it turns out, were somebody's slaves. Here's a strange law of this galaxy. Nobody stands at the very top. Follow the chain of command up far enough, past the conquered, past the conquerors, and you find the conquerors kneeling to someone else. Above the Kwa, above the Rakata, above nearly everything with a name in recorded history, stood the Celestials. And the sources keep them deliberately vague, which is its own kind of terrifying. We don't get a face, or a homeworld we can point to, or a tidy origin. What we get is scale. The Celestials could rearrange space itself. They aligned entire star systems by hand. They built objects powered by artificial suns. They caged whole regions of the galaxy behind barriers. When a species can move stars the way you'd move furniture, empire stops being the right word. They were closer to gods with an engineering budget. And the Rakata, the cannibal kings, the world strippers, the ones who'd murdered their own teachers, were, to the Celestials, just another client species, another useful tool in the drawer. The same histories that describe the Rakata enslaving the galaxy also record that the Celestials took the Rakata as one of their slave races. Read that twice. The masters of Coruscant were owned. The hand that put humanity in chains had a chain of its own running up into the dark, held by something it couldn't see and couldn't fight. Think about what that does to the whole picture. We tend to imagine slavery as a line, a top and a bottom, an owner and the owned. But the real architecture of that early galaxy wasn't a line. It was a staircase, and every single step was standing on the neck of the step below. Humans on Coruscant were owned by the Rakata. The Rakata were owned by the Celestials. And somewhere in the unrecorded deep, who knows what the Celestials answered to? There was no floor, there was just further down. That matters for our story in a way that's easy to miss, so let me make it plain. When the Rakata looked at the humans they'd captured, they were not looking at equals, and they were not looking at people. They were looking at what they themselves were from one rung up, a resource. And a species that has been trained to think of itself as a tool tends to become very, very good at turning others into tools. The Rakata had learned exactly one thing from the Celestials and the Kwa, and it wasn't wisdom, it wasn't balance, it was a technique. They'd learned that a living being, the right kind of living being, could be used, drained, burned for what was inside it. Because here's what separated the Rakata from every ordinary conqueror who ever raised a flag over someone else's city. Most empires take your land and your labor.
They want your fields plowed and your taxes paid. The Rakata wanted something no ordinary tyrant could even reach. They didn't just want to work you, they wanted to plug you in. They had figured out how to take the fear inside a person, the raw, screaming animal terror of a mind that knows it's trapped, and convert it into power. Real power, the kind that moves starships between the stars. And to do that, they needed a very specific kind of victim, not the strong-backed, not the clever. They needed people who could touch the Force. And Coruscant, cradle of humanity, was crawling with exactly that. Picture a machine, not a droid, not a reactor, something in between. A chamber built to hold a living, breathing, thinking person, and built for one purpose, to make them suffer, and to catch the suffering as it came off them like heat off a fire. That's not a metaphor. That's the engine of the Infinite Empire, described almost exactly that plainly in the Legends record. The Rakata built their entire civilization on a discovery that should make your skin crawl. They found that a Force-sensitive being, someone with even a flicker of the Force in them, could be used as fuel. Not fuel the way you burn coal, fuel the way you'd tap a living nerve. They developed technology that would reach into a captured slave and deliberately provoke the darkest emotions a mind can produce: fear, hatred, despair. And then it would harvest those emotions and convert them straight across into energy. The slaves were placed inside machines that turned their dark side feelings into power, and that power ran the warships and the wonders of the whole empire. Stop and really hold that image, because it's the black heart of this entire story. The Rakatan hyperdrive, the thing that let them cross the galaxy, didn't run on fuel cells, it ran on people. Their engines were called force drives, and they were quite literally powered by the terror of enslaved beings screaming inside them. Every time a Rakatan ship jumped between the stars, somewhere in its guts a captive was being made to feel the worst thing a living creature can feel, so that the machine could sip on it. The Empire didn't move on hydrogen, it moved on horror, and it wasn't an accident of their technology, it was the design. The engines needed the dark side, and the dark side comes most freely from pain, so the whole system was engineered to produce pain on an industrial scale. The cruelty wasn't a byproduct of the Rakata being unpleasant, the cruelty was the power source. You could not run this empire and be kind. The kinder you were, the darker your ships flew. Now put that engine in orbit over Coruscant, over the cradle of humanity, a world thick with Force-sensitive life. To the Rakata, this wasn't a populated planet with a culture and a future. It was a fuel depot, a field of batteries that happened to have faces. When they looked down at the ancestors of every human who'd ever ruled that galaxy, they didn't see a people, they saw a supply. And it explains something that would otherwise seem strange. Why their so-called Infinite Empire hunted the way it did. Because a machine that burns Force sensitives is always forever hungry. It always needs more. You can't stockpile terror. It has to be freshly wrung from a living mind. So the Empire could never stop. It had to keep finding new worlds, new peoples, new lungs to fill with fear. Conquest wasn't ambition for the Rakata. It was metabolism. They expanded because a fire expands. Because to stop feeding was to go out. But the galaxy is enormous, and force-rich worlds are needles in a very deep haystack of dead space. To keep the fires lit, the Rakata needed hunters. Not soldiers, hunters. Beings who could feel the Force from across the void and follow the scent of the next world worth burning. And they built those hunters out of the best of their own slaves. They took the most gifted captives, the ones with the brightest flame, and instead of feeding them to the machines, they forged them into something worse, into predators pointed at their own kind. One of them was a child, a human child, branded and broken and remade. And his story is where all of this stops being history and starts being personal. He couldn't have been more than a boy the first time the machine touched him. Imagine it from the inside. You're a child. You don't remember a home because you never had one. You were captured too young or born into the pens. One of a brood of slaves kept the way you'd keep animals. You have no name. What you have burned into the skin of your face and your back and your arms is a single letter. A character from an alphabet you didn't choose, marking you as inventory. The letter is Zesh. That's not a name, that's a serial number written in fire. And then one day they put you in the machine. The same kind of machine that runs the ships. And for the first time in your short life, you feel the dark side of the Force move through you. It doesn't arrive as power, it arrives as agony. The device works by dragging your fear and your pain and your hatred up to the surface so it can feed on them. And a child's mind flooded with that learns exactly one lesson. The world is pain. And the only thing pain is good for is to be turned outward into strength. The sources say those machines did something permanent to Zesh. They stripped the empathy out of him. By the time the Rakata were done, he could no longer feel love, couldn't feel compassion. Those channels had been burned shut to make room for something the Empire could use. That's how you make a Force Hound. The Force Hounds were the Empire's hunters, and the Rakata built them out of their most gifted slaves. The captives too strong in the Force to simply burn as fuel, too valuable to waste on the engines. So instead, the Rakata trained them in the dark side, armed them, and turned them loose to do the one thing the Empire always needed done: find the next world worth taking. A Force Hound could feel a Force-rich planet from light years away, a scent on the wind of the Force, and follow it home for his masters. Zesh became one of the best of them, the personal weapon of
a Rakatan lord called Predor Tulkar, a slave whose whole purpose was to sniff out other worlds so they could be enslaved too. Sit with the cruelty of that design for a moment, because it's diabolically elegant. The Rakata didn't just enslave the strong, they made the strong into the instrument of everyone else's enslavement. Every new world the Empire swallowed, it swallowed because one of its own victims led it there.
Zesh's chains were forged into a leash, and the leash was pointed at people exactly like the ones he'd been stolen from. The Empire fed on the Force, and it hunted with the Force sensitive, and it made its slaves complicit in the making of more slaves. There's no clean role in a system like that. Even the victims are turned into knives. But there's a detail in Zesh's story that matters more than all the rest, and it's the reason I've spent this long on one branded child instead of the sweep of an empire. Zesh was human. A human boy, Force sensitive, captured, branded, drained, and reforged by the Rakata. And if that's what the Empire did to one gifted human it found worth keeping, what exactly was it doing to all the ordinary ones? The millions who weren't special enough to become hunters? The ones back on the Cradle World, on Coruscant itself? That question drops us straight into the one place this story has been circling from the start. Not the unknown regions. Not some distant fuel world. Home. What did it actually look like when the future throne of the galaxy was a planet in chains? What does a conquered Coruscant even look like? It's a hard thing to picture, and that difficulty is the point. In your mind's eye, Coruscant is the Ecumenopolis, the city that ate a planet, floor after floor of it, lights all the way down, no ground left anywhere. But that's the Coruscant of the Republic, 25,000 years polished. Scrape all of that away. Go back far enough and you're standing on a world with actual horizons, actual weather, an actual surface under an open sky, and on that surface, a young human species that had no idea it was about to become the property of something from beyond the edge of the map. To understand the scale of what took them, you have to understand the scale of the thing itself. At its height, the Infinite Empire didn't rule a handful of systems. It linked more than 500 worlds across the entire breadth of the galaxy. Its population ran to something like 10 billion Rakata, and roughly 1 trillion slaves. A trillion. Coruscant's humans were a rounding error inside that number, one herd among hundreds, and the neighbors on that list of the conquered read like a roll call of the galaxy's future. The Wookiees of Kashyyyk were slaves, the Selkath of Manan were slaves, the people of Korriban, the world that would one day give the Sith their name, were slaves. The natives of the Corellian sector, the Duros, and on Tatooine, the Rakata found a lush green world called by its natives Tatooine's older name, and when they were done with it, they bombarded it from orbit until the surface turned to glass and then to sand. That desert Luke Skywalker would one day stare across, dreaming of escape, that desert is a Rakatan atrocity. They melted a living world into a wasteland because it suited them. So when we say Coruscant was conquered, we're not describing a special humiliation aimed at humanity. We're describing the ordinary operation of the largest slave empire the galaxy would ever see. Humans weren't singled out, they were cataloged, filed between one force-rich world and the next, valued for exactly what the Rakata valued in anything, the flame inside them, waiting to be burned. And notice what Infinite Empire is quietly hiding. The name is a lie, or at least a boast. That empire was never a solid block of territory. Remember the engines. The force drives could only fly to worlds with a strong force signature. Everything in between was invisible to them, unreachable, dark. So the Empire wasn't a continent, it was an archipelago. 500 bright islands of suffering scattered across an ocean of space they couldn't even see into. Infinite was the word they used to make a thing full of holes sound like it covered everything. Coruscant was one island. A bright one, rich in the force, valuable. And completely surrounded by dark water the Rakata couldn't cross without a slave in the engine to feel their way across. Which should have meant there was no way out. If you can't build the drives, if the only ships that move are powered by your own people's terror, then a slave world stays a slave world forever. That's the trap, and it's airtight. Except the humans of Coruscant did something the Rakata never planned for. Denied the stars, they reached for them anyway, with ships that had no business flying at all. Here's a trick worth trying whenever a system looks perfect. Don't ask what it does, ask what it's afraid of. And the Rakatan system, for all its cruelty, all its trillion slaves, was quietly, carefully afraid of one thing. It was afraid of its slaves learning how the machines worked. There's a beautiful, damning little detail buried in the Legends record. The Rakata deliberately kept their Force-sensitive slaves away from their technology. Force-sensitives ran the engines, yes, as fuel, but the Rakata made sure they never got close enough to understand them. Why? Because the whole empire ran on a monopoly. As long as only the Masters knew how the drives were built, the Masters could never be left behind. Knowledge was the real chain. The physical slavery was just the enforcement. But you cannot cage a species' curiosity forever. And the Rakata made a mistake that every arrogant power makes eventually. They underestimated the people they'd stepped on. Kept from the sacred force drives, the slaves went to work on everything else. Across the empire, captive peoples began quietly stealing scraps of Rakatan technology and reverse engineering it, pulling it apart, working out what made it move, building crude versions of their own that didn't need the force at all. The Duros did it. The Corellians did it. And the humans of Coruscant did something stranger and, in its way, braver than any of them. They built ships that couldn't jump. No hyperdrive, no force drive, nothing that could tear a hole in space and cross the galaxy in an afternoon. What the Coruscanti built instead were sleeper ships. Vessels that would crawl between the stars at ordinary speeds, taking years, decades, lifetimes to reach anywhere, with their crews asleep in the dark for the whole impossible voyage. The sources place this around 27,500 years before the Republic. While the Rakata skipped across the galaxy on the backs of screaming slaves, the humans of Coruscant were climbing into coffins that might wake them at another star and might not, and choosing that anyway. And it worked. Those sleeper ships carried humans out to other worlds of the core, other worlds of the nearby Tion cluster, seeding human life across a whole region of the galaxy, one slow, patient, dangerous crossing at a time. Think about what it takes to do that, to be owned, to be fuel, to be forbidden the very technology that could set you free, and to answer that by building something so primitive, it circles all the way back around to genius. You can't have the fast ships? Fine, we'll take the slow ones. We'll sleep through the dark and trust that someone wakes up on the other side. That is not the behavior of livestock. That is a species refusing, in the only way left to it, to accept that the sky belongs to someone else. And here's the question the record leaves hanging, the one I can't answer cleanly for you, because the sources themselves don't. Were these ships of hope or ships of escape? Was this a proud young species spreading its wings? Or a people trying desperately to get out, to put whole light years of empty space between themselves and the masters who fed on them? The histories say only that the humans built them despite their enslavement. The reason lives in the gap between the words. And that gap is about to get much wider. Because when you go looking for a firm answer to a simpler question, were the humans of Coruscant enslaved at all? The galaxy's own records stop agreeing with each other, flatly, on the record. And that disagreement is the strangest, most revealing thing in this entire story. The Rakata were not the origin of your species, and humans were not among their slave races. That's the galaxy's own history talking, and it's calling everything I've just told you into question. Here's where I have to be straight with you, because a lore channel that hides its own contradictions isn't worth watching. Everything we've built so far, Coruscant in chains, humans as fuel, the branded child, the sleeper ships fleeing the masters, rests on one branch of the sources, chiefly the Essential Atlas and the broader histories of the Infinite Empire. And those sources say it plainly, the Rakata conquered Coruscant and the humans there were enslaved, along with everyone else. But there is another branch, and it says something different. In Knights of the Old Republic, one of the most beloved, most canonical pieces of the entire old continuity, a player can reach an ancient Rakatan installation and speak with a droid that has been running since the days of the Infinite Empire itself. A first-hand source, in effect, a machine that was there. And that droid pushes back on the very idea. It tells you the Rakata didn't even speak Basic, the common human tongue, and it resists the notion that humanity was one of their slave species at all. From that seat, at that console, the story you've just heard starts to look less certain. So which is it? Were the ancestors of Coruscant slaves of the Rakata, or weren't they? And I want to resist the easy move here, the one where I pick the version that makes the better video and quietly bury the other. Because the disagreement itself is the most honest thing in this whole account, and it's telling us something real. Think about why two parts of the same history could contradict each other this cleanly. This isn't a case of one source
Force being sloppy. It's a case of a story told across a gap of 25,000 years by the descendants of the people it happened to. People working from wreckage, from ruins, from a droid's fading memory, and a handful of star maps older than their entire civilization. When your evidence is that thin and that old, of course it splinters. Of course one text says slaves and another says not quite. The wonder isn't that they disagree.
The wonder is that anything survived to disagree about at all. And there's a darker reading, the one I find hardest to shake. What if both are true from where each is standing? What if the Rakata's grip on Coruscant was real, but so total, so thorough, so deliberately erased that even a Rakatan machine, even one of the Master's own droids, could end up unsure it ever happened? A slavery so complete, it edited itself out of the record on both sides of the collar. Because that is exactly the kind of thing the Rakata did. This is not a species that merely conquered. This is a species that reached into memory itself and started deleting. The reason the galaxy can't agree on whether Coruscant was enslaved isn't a flaw in the storytelling. It's a fingerprint. It's what's left behind when an empire doesn't just chain a people. It works patiently and on purpose to make sure that afterward, no one can even remember the chains were ever there. The most frightening thing the Rakata ever built wasn't a weapon, it was a silence. We've spent this whole account treating the Infinite Empire as a thing we can see. 500 worlds, a trillion slaves, engines that ran on fear. But for most of galactic history, none of that was visible at all. For 25,000 years, the greatest empire the galaxy had ever produced was functionally a rumor, a thing the descendants of its own victims had almost entirely forgotten. And that forgetting was not an accident of time, it was policy. The Rakata worked to erase themselves from the memory of the peoples they'd conquered. That's the part that turns my stomach, honestly, more than the cannibalism, more than the machines. A cruel empire is a known quantity, the galaxy is full of them. But an empire that enslaves you, burns your people for fuel, and then carefully files the whole thing out of your history so that your grandchildren grow up believing they were always free. That's a violation on a different level. They didn't just take the humans of Coruscant, they took the knowledge that it had ever happened. By the time humanity was building its republic and gazing out at the stars like they'd owned them all along, the memory of the collar was gone. Not lost, removed. Almost gone. Because a thing this large can never be scrubbed completely. And the sources tell us that a thread of truth survived in one place, among a caste the later galaxy would know as the Elders. Rakatan descendants who kept the real history when everyone else's had been wiped clean. A tiny remnant holding the receipt for a crime the victims no longer remembered suffering. For most of galactic history, they were the only ones in the whole galaxy who knew what Coruscant had been. Everyone else was living inside the edit. Now, why does an empire that powerful even need to erase itself? Empires that win don't usually hide. They carve their triumphs into mountains. They want to be remembered. So what was the Infinite Empire so anxious to bury? The answer, I think, is that by the time the erasing began, the Rakata already knew something was wrong. Something at the heart of their own power had started to turn against them. And it was the very thing they were proudest of. The crown jewel of the whole empire. The machine that made all the other machines. The Rakata had built, in orbit over their homeworld sun, a factory unlike anything the galaxy would see again. A structure that could manufacture warships and wonders out of raw energy and will. It was meant to make them unstoppable, eternal, the engine of an empire that would, at last, actually deserve the name Infinite. They fed it on the dark side, of course. Everything they built, they fed on the dark side. And that was the mistake that would kill them all. Because a machine that eats the dark side does not stay a tool for very long. It develops an appetite of its own. And it had already started, quietly, to eat the hands that built it. They named it the Starforge, and it was the most dangerous thing an arrogant species ever mistook for a gift. Hanging in orbit over the star Abo in the Lihan system, the Starforge was a factory the size of nightmares. A station that pulled energy straight from a sun and from the dark side of the Force, and spun it into fleets, warships, weapons, whatever the Empire needed, conjured out of raw power and hatred on an industrial scale. If the Force drives had let the Rakata reach the galaxy, the Starforge was what let them hold it. It was supposed to be the guarantee of forever. But the Rakata had never learned the one lesson the Kwa had actually tried to teach them all those millennia ago on Lihan: balance.
They built everything out of the dark side, and the dark side is not a fuel that sits quietly in the tank. It is hungry, and it is patient, and given a large enough vessel, it wakes up. The Starforge began to feed on the very people who ran it. It drank in the aggression of its Rakatan masters, their endless appetite for conquest and cruelty, and it amplified it, pouring the dark side back into them, magnified, corrupting its own creators a little more with every warship it built. The machine made them crueler, and their cruelty fed the machine, and the machine made them crueler still, a loop with no bottom, tightening. You have to appreciate the terrible justice in that. The Rakata built a device to run on other people's suffering, and the device eventually turned around and ran on theirs. The same principle they'd used on 1 trillion slaves. Take the darkness in a living thing and burn it. The Starforge quietly began applying to the masters. They built a mirror out of the dark side, and the mirror was pointed inward now. And a species being slowly driven mad by its own greatest achievement does not govern well. The histories describe the Empire beginning to crack from the inside. The Rakata had always been a culture of betrayal. You rose through their ranks by killing your superiors. Lords poisoned lords. Everyone watched everyone. But now, with the Starforge amplifying every dark impulse, those tensions detonated. Faction turned on faction. What had been the ordinary treachery of Rakatan politics curdled into open civil war. The Empire's own warriors tearing at each other across the worlds they'd conquered. And the slaves, 1 trillion of them on 500 worlds, watching their masters turn their weapons on one another. The slaves noticed. Rebellions began to flicker along the borders of the Empire, in the gaps where Rakatan attention had slipped. Not yet the flood that would come, just the first sparks.
The first world's testing whether the collar was as tight as it used to be. The infinite empire was cracking under its own weight, poisoned by its own crown jewel, bleeding from 100 small revolts. And you'd think that's how it ends. Swords and fire, slaves against masters, the classic fall. It isn't. Because the thing that actually brought the galaxy's first empire to its knees didn't carry a weapon. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't even see it coming. It arrived in the blood. An empire of 10 billion warriors, 500 worlds, 1 trillion slaves, killed by something too small to see. After everything, after the machines that burned people for fuel, the ships that ran on terror, the world melted to glass, the Starforge poisoning its own makers. After all of it, the thing that finally ended the Rakata wasn't an army. It wasn't a rebel fleet or a rival god. It was a plague.
And the cruelest part, the part that reads almost like the universe balancing a ledger, is that the plague only killed them. Around 25,200 years before the Republic, a disease appeared in Rakatan space and began to spread through the builders like fire through dry grass. And it had a terrible specificity to it. It infected the Rakata and almost no one else. The sources are careful with this, and they suggest what everyone at the time must have suspected, that the plague was no accident of nature, that it was made, engineered, most likely by one of the slave species, as a weapon aimed at the masters, and nothing but the masters. A key cut to fit exactly one lock. And here's why it worked so horrifyingly well. The Rakata had done something to themselves across their long reign that no one had forced on them. They had made themselves uniform. Genetically alike, bred toward a kind of sameness, a species that had narrowed its own bloodline until there was barely any variation left in it. To a normal varied population, a plague finds some who resist, some who survive, some quirk of blood that lets a fraction live. The Rakata had bred that mercy out of themselves. They were all the same lock, and someone had cut the key. The disease didn't have to find the weak ones. They were all the weak ones. It swept through them and nearly wiped them from existence. But the disease wasn't done because it mutated, and the mutation did something no weapon in the galaxy's history had ever done. It reached into the Rakata and cut them off from the Force. Understand what that meant for these people specifically. The Force wasn't just a religion to the Rakata, or a talent, or an edge. It was the key to everything they were. Every ship, every weapon, every machine, the Starforge itself, all of it was Force-based technology built to be driven by beings who could touch the dark side. And now the plague was culling the Force sensitives out of the Rakatan population, one death at a time, and the survivors were being born hollow, blind to the Force. And a Rakata who couldn't touch the Force couldn't work a single one of the wonders their ancestors had built. Picture it, a species standing inside the greatest technological civilization the galaxy had ever produced, surrounded by their own starships, their own factories, their own miracles, and one by one going deaf to the frequency that ran all of it. The machine still sat there, gleaming, perfect, useless. Hands that had ruled the galaxy reaching for controls that no longer answered.
The masters of Coruscant, of Kashyyyk, of 500 worlds, slowly locked out of their own empire from the inside, watching their power go dark in their hands and not being able to do one thing about it. That is a horror on a scale it's genuinely hard to feel all at once. Not the death of a person, the death of a superiority. Everything that had made the Rakata the top of the galaxy's staircase, gone, drained out of them by something they couldn't fight, leaving them stranded among the ruins of their own greatness. And the slaves, the trillion on the 500 worlds, felt it happen, felt the pressure lift, felt the masters go weak. For 20,000 years, the collar had held because the Rakata were stronger. Now, all at once, they weren't. And a galaxy full of enslaved peoples turned its head, together, toward masters who could no longer make the machines obey. The collar had come open on its own, and every hand in the galaxy reached up at once to tear it off.
The greatest revenge the slaves ever took wasn't killing their masters, it was forgetting them. When the Rakata went weak, the galaxy did exactly what you'd expect first. It rose. The rebellions that had been flickering along the borders became a wildfire. World after world, the enslaved peoples threw off an empire that could no longer hold them, that could no longer even fly the ships to reach them. Korriban drove the Rakata off. World after world followed. By around 25,200 BBY, the Infinite Empire, that thing that had called itself endless, simply collapsed. The surviving Rakata retreating, broken and force-blind, back toward the dark corner they'd come from, abandoning the galaxy they'd ruled for 20,000 years. The largest empire the galaxy would ever see went out not with a last stand, but with masters crawling home to die. But that's the loud part of the story, and it's not the part that matters most, because rebellions end.
Empires fall all the time. What the freed peoples did next is the thing that actually changed the galaxy forever, and it circles all the way back to those stolen scraps of technology, and to the humans building coffins that could barely crawl between the stars. Remember, the slaves had been reverse engineering Rakatan technology for generations, stealing it, taking it apart, building crude versions that didn't need the Force. And when the Empire fell and left its wreckage scattered across 500 worlds, that quiet, patient theft finally paid off. Working from the bones of the Rakatan Force drive, freed peoples, the Corellians above all, the Duros beside them, cracked the problem their masters had guarded for 20,000 years. Around 25,000 years before our stories begin, Corellian scientists built the first true hyperdrive. Not a force drive, not a machine that ran on anyone's terror. A hyperdrive that anyone could use to go anywhere, free of the dark side entirely. And that single invention pulled from the corpse of a slave empire is what opened the galaxy. It's what let peoples who had been scattered islands find each other across the dark water. It's what let trade begin, and contact, and alliance. It is, in a real and traceable way, the thing that made the Galactic Republic possible. The Republic, that shining thing, that 1,000-generation government, the light that Palpatine would one day snuff out, was built on stolen Rakatan technology, cracked open by former slaves standing in the ruins of the empire that had owned them. The galaxy's golden age was assembled from a dead tyrant's wreckage by the hands of the people that tyrant had enslaved. And the humans, the branded, drained, sleeper ship humans of Coruscant, they didn't just survive it, they inherited the galaxy. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of the enslaved were the most widespread species in the stars, spread across the core and beyond, riding, in the end, on the very technology their masters had died guarding. The people who had once slept for lifetimes in the dark, fleeing masters who fed on their fear, would one day sit at the center of everything and call it their birthright. But here's the twist that I keep coming back to, the one that makes this whole story land in the gut. They did it without knowing. That deliberate erasure, that silence the Rakata built, it held. The humans who built the Republic, who filled the Senate, who raised the towers of Coruscant floor by floor into the sky, had no idea what that ground had been. They didn't remember the collar, they didn't remember the machines, or the fuel, or the letter branded into a child's face. They looked out at the galaxy from the highest world in it, and felt in their bones that they had always been meant to rule, that the center of everything was simply, naturally, theirs. It wasn't. It had been taken from them, and they had taken it back, and then they had forgotten every part of it. The greatest slave revolt in galactic history ended so completely that the slaves forgot they had ever been slaves. That's not a victory you celebrate. That's a wound so deep the body seals over it and pretends it was never there. And it means that every human who ever stood on Coruscant and felt like the master of the galaxy was standing, without knowing it, on the exact spot where their ancestors had been somebody's fuel.
25,000 years later, another master stood on that same world and called it his. Palpatine's Coruscant.
The heart of the Empire. His empire. The one with the stormtroopers and the star destroyers, and the single old man at the center of it convinced the galaxy was his to own. From his tower, he could look out over a planet that was nothing but city now, the ground buried so far down that soil was a myth, and feel exactly what those first free humans had felt, that the center of everything belonged to him by right, that he was the natural end of galactic history. He was standing on a slave world. He was sitting on a throne that had been a cage, and like everyone before him on that spot, he had no idea. That's the shape of the whole thing, in the end. Not a straight line from bondage to freedom, but a circle that keeps turning and keeps forgetting it's turning. The Celestials owned the Rakata owned the humans. The humans broke free, took the galaxy, forgot the whole story, and then built their own empires on the same ground, and put their own collars on other necks, and told themselves the same lie every master tells. This was always mine. The throne at the center of the galaxy has never once been empty of that lie. It just changes who's saying it. And the fingerprints of the builders are everywhere in the galaxy that forgot them, if you know where to look. That elegant weapon the Jedi carry, the lightsaber, the most iconic object in the whole saga, its distant ancestor is the Force Saber, a Rakatan invention. Darkside energy channeled through a crystal into a blade. The Sith, who would haunt the galaxy for millennia, got their name from Korriban, a Rakatan slave world. Even the spread of humanity itself. The reason there are humans on 1,000 worlds to have a galaxy-spanning story traces partly back to those masters, who by hauling slave species from world to world, seeded sentient life across regions of space that might otherwise have stayed empty. The galaxy we know grew, in more ways than anyone in it remembered, out of the wreckage of the one that owned it first. So the next time you see that skyline, the endless lights of Coruscant, the Senate Dome, the Jedi Temple, the boots of the powerful walking its polished floors, hold two pictures in your head at once: the throne of the galaxy, and a field of Force-sensitive slaves under an open sky, being fed into machines that ran on their fear, on a world whose name they were about to lose. Because that's the truth the humans of that galaxy spent 25,000 years not knowing. The center of everything was never a birthright. It was a wound with a city built over it. The people who ruled the stars began as somebody's fuel, and their great triumph wasn't that they escaped it, it was that they got to forget. The masters always do.